The Israel waged war for 6 days after reaching an agreement by the country leadership and the agreement of military units. The Six-Day War, or better known as the 1967 Arab-Israel War, erupted on June 5, 1967 and ended on June 11, 1967. The realism approach to the 1967 Arab-Israel War. The first is the state as a unit of analysis and a leading actor in world politics. The realism approach makes the states the most fundamental units of analysis and actor in studying issues of international relations and world politics. The country is placed in the most critical position compared to the other units of analysis such as individual, civil society, political parties, and regional institutions. For the second one is the assumption that humans are naturally greedy and evil. In the context of the Arab-Israel War, such traits are highly synonymous with Israel's action that shows greed and evil in their effort to expand Israel's border by seizing the lands of Palestinian Muslims and exploiting the resources of its neighboring countries. Third, the assumption that war is inevitable. Discussion and dispute over national interests for Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria have invited war despite peace and ceasefire agreement have been signed. Fourth, the assumption that a state action is rational. Egypt closing the Straits of Tiran and the Gulf of Aqaba in May 1967 to Israeli ships was considered rational. Egypt and the other Arab countries felt threatened by Israel's military capabilities backed by Britain and America. Thus, by closing Israeli shipping routes, it could put pressure on Israel and cripple the economy and disrupt its peacekeeping activities. Such actions are indeed considered rational by Egypt and Arab countries.
The parties involved in Arab-Israel War in 1967. First is Arab League. The organization of Arab League is intended to help its member states to manage national policy and enhance good cooperation between member states. In addition, the Arab League also serves as an organization that seeks to find a solution to the crisis in the countries of the Arab League. During the Six-Day War, Israel occupied neighboring Arab territories, caused the Arab League to expand its boycott in the territory. The Arab army managed to defeat the Israelis. Later, Israel asked the United States to open a ceasefire using the United Nations (UN). After that, counterattacks were carried out by Israel during a ceasefire implemented when Israeli military forces needed several districts such as Ramallah, the center part of Galilee, and Nazareth. The second parties is PBB, or the United Nations. The war situation during Israel's attack. Counterattacks at the time of the ceasefire had received intervention from the UN when People's Count Bernadette was appointed mediator for the ceasefire issue of the Arab-Israeli War. Israel also carried out attacks on the military bases of Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Syria on June 5, 1967. Israel attacks carried out towards the Nile River and the Suez Canal in Egypt. Eating shots were fired by the head of the United Arab Republic, or UAR, Gamal Abdel Nasser, but the attack failed to defend UAR territory in Gaza and Sinai.
The suggestion and recommendation of the Arab-Israel War is the balance of power. In terms of the balance of power in world politics, which is considered realism, is a must for a country to choose the dominance of a great power that can influence or threaten the security of other countries. The realists indeed reduced the concept of balance of power because it was able to prepare the world for an atmosphere of peace and harmony without any of the massive war that took place during the First World War and the Second World War. To achieve a balance of power, power itself needs to be distributed relatively to the countries in world politics. Each country is equal and capable of dominating other countries. In addition, implement a strong peace treaty. The Six-Day War of 1967 has proved that there is no cooperation that Israel can do with the Arab world except enmity, revenge, and mutual suspicion. The same is true when viewed about war, which in the view of realism is difficult to avoid. Three series of wars have erupted throughout the Arab-Israel conflict, including the war in 1967. Once the peace and ceasefire agreement was implemented, it still failed to erupt war between Israel with the alliance of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan.
In conclusion, the country is the most important actor in the international system. The war has highlighted the role of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, which dominated several crises until war broke out. The role of these countries has also undermined the function of the UN and the Arab League as non-state actors deemed responsible for any international and regional issues such as the war case. The ability of this theory is primarily based on its close connection with the war. All the facts of the case, the chronology, the leaders' policies, the reactions of the superpowers, and the actions of the state contained in the events of the 1967 Arab-Israel Six-Day War serve as a guide in understanding the arguments and ideas presented by the realists.